Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Trade Australia. I'm your host, Lawrence Christophels. In this episode, with the Australian Senate passing a bill banning the importation of goods from forced labour late last month, all Australian importers, distributors and retailers may have to prepare for the fact that they may need to ensure they have full visibility across their global supply chains in the near future. In today's episode, we discuss what this means in further detail, as well as providing some guidance on the broader topics of modern slavery and ethical supply chains. Joining me now is Alexander Coward, expert on modern slavery and supply chain transparency, and also an advisor to Pillar 2. Alex has led the development and implementation of the Australian government's landmark Modern Slavery Act, helping oversee the 10-month-long national consultation process and draft the text of the legislation itself. He also delivered an extensive national awareness raising program about the Act for Australian businesses and led the development of Australia's online register for modern slavery statements, which is the first government-run website of its kind anywhere in the world. Thanks for joining us, Alexander. Can you tell us, what would the bill mean to importers and exporters?
Thanks, Lawrence. Great to be with you. So the Australian Parliament is currently considering draft legislation, which is formally titled the Customs Amendment Banning Goods Produced by Forced Labour Bill. And in simple terms, the legislation would do what it says on the tin, and that, of course, has obvious implications for Australia's import-export community. The core of the legislative change would be to modify our Federal Customs Act to prohibit the importation into Australia of goods that are manufactured, and to use the legislation's words, wholly or in part using forced labour. And it's an extremely short piece of legislation. It simply inserts 32 new words into the Customs Act. But if enacted, its ramifications would be quite profound for importers. Now, of course, my comments aren't legal advice, but we know that it would be a system under the legislation where the Australian Border Force is, in effect, empowered to check or to verify the provenance of goods imported into Australia that are seen as high risk for modern slavery, such as textiles, rubber gloves, or electronics, potentially to seize those goods or to prohibit them from crossing the border. And as part of that process, there may, of course, be penalties for importers or for companies associated with the import of those products.
Wonderful. Thanks for such a detailed summary of that. And what about the status of the bill at the moment?
So there's really three key things to keep in mind about this bill. And the first, of course, is that it's a private member's bill. So it's been put forward by a crossbench senator, Senator Patrick. And what the private member's bill designation means is that it's not a government bill. It's legislation put forward by another member of parliament. And so as a result, the legislation hasn't gone through the kind of consultation or development process that government legislation would. And at least for the current time, the legislation doesn't have the support of the Australian government, which means that it currently doesn't have the numbers to progress through the parliament, which is the second key thing to keep in mind about this legislation, which is that at present, it's proposed legislation, it's draft legislation that has been approved by one house of the Australian Parliament, the Senate, but not by the House of Representatives.
Okay.
And the third thing, perhaps to add just for completeness about the legislation, is that there's a whole lot of questions that we still have to answer about how it would work in practice. So as we said earlier, it's 32 words. It's a small change with big implications for our Customs Act. And there's still a lot of work to do around the edges of, well, what would this actually look like in practice for our importers?
Yeah, that again, it's a great update of the processes involved. How does this bill relate to the Commonwealth Modern Slavery Act, and how does it compare to other countries such as the US and what their actions are like at the moment?
So we're all well aware that Australia has taken action already on modern slavery in supply chains through the Modern Slavery Act, which is an initiative that of course, has been discussed by you on this program before. And really what the Modern Slavery Act tries to do is to hold large Australian businesses publicly accountable for the actions that they might be taking or not taking to manage modern slavery risks in their global operations and their global supply chains. And that can be risks inside Australia, it can be risks overseas. And now the proposed import ban is a really different model. It argues that if we can stop goods that may have been produced outside Australia using forced labour, a form of modern slavery, from crossing the border, then that's an effective way to drive change to the way that modern slavery is present in global supply chains, and to address and combat the prevalence of modern slavery. And there's, of course, very different views on the effectiveness of both these legislative approaches. And what's really important to keep in mind is that none of these are a silver bullet. We know that modern slavery is deeply entrenched in the global economy. We know there's no simple answers and no simple tools to combating it. And so it's important that we do think really carefully about the different legislative tools that we have to apply to this challenge. And globally, of course, we've seen Western countries increasingly looking to and having conversations about these kind of import bans, especially in the context of concern about forced labor in Western China. The US is currently the only country that's actively enforcing an import ban framework, and that's been in place in the United States for a number of years, but the implementation of that framework has really escalated over the past several years, particularly during the Trump presidency, which has carried over to the Biden administration. And what we've seen is since 2019, the US government has issued over 27 withhold release orders, which are orders that they use to identify particular products that are of concern to them. And that's covered everything from Chinese tomatoes and hair products to Malaysian rubber gloves. And perhaps unsurprisingly, in the context of the trade relationship between the US and China, a lot of those orders, the vast majority, have been focused on China. So in some way, we know that there's examples out there of this legislation working, but the real example that we have is the US, and there's some very unique and particular geostrategic considerations around the way that import ban framework has played out.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great context to where Australia sits amongst that as well. Alexander, what are the key challenges that will be associated with the implementation of this import ban and as proposed in the bill? And, identifying the products which will be prohibited, addressing the fraudulent customs data to avoid restrictions. How do we, as you said before earlier, in practice, it's going to be a bit of a tough ask, isn't it?
It is, and the jury's really still out on the effectiveness of these kind of approaches for precisely some of the reasons that you mentioned. And of course, it goes without saying that no country should be importing goods made using modern slavery across its borders. And of course, no importers want to be involved in that process. But there's some real practical challenges to how this scheme might work in practice. And those, of course, aren't a reason to reject the legislation, but they're cause for some more consideration around how this might actually work. And put simply, these challenges can really be summarized in one question, which is how can we identify with certainty products made using modern slavery, and how can we manage the resourcing that this would entail, both from a government perspective, but potentially also from the perspective of importers and other companies. And as we've said, we know that modern slavery is deeply embedded in the global economy. We know that it's prevalent across a whole range of industries. And the US experience shows us that identifying products which are made using modern slavery is time-consuming, it's resource-intensive, and it's primarily only feasible for unrefined materials like textiles rather than complex consumer goods like mobile phones or other electronics devices. And that's very much the way that we've seen the US import ban scheme play out, which again is the main precedent that we have for this. And I think it's telling that even as the world's largest economy and with the resourcing that goes along with that, the US has only issued those 27 orders in 3 years, most of which have been China focused. And so there's real questions still about whether a country like Australia could meaningfully implement a comprehensive ban that is applied across all sectors and all countries. And again, that's not a reason to bin the legislation, but cause perhaps for more consultation and more consideration.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks so much, Alexander. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show to talk about this in detail. And, it really sheds a lot of light, as you say, on everyone trying to do the right thing, and whether or not it actually eventually comes into practice. I think it is a great discussion that we're all having about it anyway. So thanks once again. Wish you all the best, and looking forward to speaking to you again very soon, Alexander.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So you just heard from Alexander Coward. He's an expert on modern slavery, as I mentioned earlier. So Stick around. After the break, we'll be joined by another industry expert talking about this hot topic. Thank you.
Now is the time to reduce costs and get better service from your logistics partners. We go to market for you. We do all the work, you make all the decisions. First, we review your requirements, customized to your business. Then, we design your tender documents, RFQ and submission templates. Next, we put it out to market, to suitable service providers only. We analyse and score the submissions using a weighted scorecard. We shortlist the best candidates specifically matched to your needs. We invite presentations from the candidates. They compete for your business. You select and enjoy the benefits, including KPIs and SLAs. We offer fixed price programs starting from as little as $5,000. When did you last compare your service providers? Contact us today at the Australian Trade and Logistics Corporation.
Our next guest is Kylie Arabi, anti-trafficking practitioner and researcher. She's designed anti-slavery programming and interventions in the United Kingdom, Bangladesh, and here in Australia, where she currently manages a support service for survivors of modern slavery for the Australian Red Cross. Here's what she's got to say about the latest forced labour bill. Thanks for finding the time for joining us today, Kyla. How are you?
I'm really well, thanks, and thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Now, Kyla, what does the modern slavery in Australia look like right now?
It's a great question, and it's unfortunately really hard to actually predict the extent of modern slavery, both in Australia and globally. But we know that it does exist in Australia. No country in the world is immune to modern slavery and human trafficking. And here there was some really great research done by the Australian Institute of Criminology a few years ago, and they estimated that between about 15 and 16, there was 1,300 to 1,900 people who had fallen victim to modern slavery in Australia. But at the same time, that research showed that for every one person that is identified as a victim, there's actually another 4 people that are not identified. And that's how hidden this issue is. However, it's often called hidden in plain sight, because although it's really hard to detect, it happens, within our communities, and it happens, within, next door. It might be happening in your own neighbourhood, in your next door neighbour, and that's why it's called kind of hidden in plain sight, because once you're able to actually understand it and identify the indicators, that's when it becomes easier to detect.
Wow, yeah, it's really mind-boggling when you think there's only 1 in 4 being actually reported. So those numbers, when you think about Australia and what we perceive as risk, but how does that compare? What's modern slavery look like on a global level? How would you sort of describe that, please, Carla?
Yeah, so I guess it's also important to note that the term modern slavery is an umbrella term. So it is inclusive of a range of different practices, including forced labour, sexual exploitation, forced marriage. And when we're talking about modern slavery in global supply chains, we're really referring to forced labour. And at a global scale, there's a range of different estimates, but some of the most reliable data tells us there's about 21 million people globally who are being forced to work in global supply chains by private enterprises. And then on top of that number, around about another 4 million who are in forced labour due to state-sanctioned forced labour. So practices that are being condoned by countries that are putting people in these situations of being able to refuse work.
Wow, yeah, it's a pretty sad state of affairs when you paint those sort of numbers, really, isn't it?
Yeah, significant.
Yeah, and Carla, Australia's already got the Modern Slavery Act. Why is the forced labour bill necessary, in your opinion? Why is it needed as well?
So there are two fundamentally different pieces of legislation that work in very different ways. So the Forced Labour Bill is banning the importation of goods made with forced labour. So it's a really action-orientated bill that has the potential to have immediate impact to stop, goods that are currently being imported into Australia that have been made with forced labour from areas where there's really well-documented evidence of that forced labour occurring. Whereas the Modern Slavery Act, unfortunately, doesn't do that. It is actually a piece of legislation that mandates reporting rather than action. So it does not mandate that businesses take any specific level of action in order to prevent that forced labour being part of their supply chain. Instead, it mandates that businesses do a risk assessment and that they take action in response to that risk, but it doesn't actually have any kind of level of required action in there. So it's a much more slow acting piece of legislation. So it aims to create change over a long period of time. And there's some other really fundamental flaws in the Modern Slavery Act, being that there's no penalties, no financial penalties for non-compliance. So there's quite a lot of criticism over the Modern Slavery Act for its ineffectiveness to actually have meaningful change, to make meaningful change in addressing this issue of modern slavery. And that's why really this forced labour bill, which we're pretty excited about, has the potential to actually take immediate action to prevent Australian businesses and importers of goods into Australia being complicit in modern slavery.
Yeah, thanks for putting that all into context for all the viewers and myself included, Carla. I mean, apart from the legislation and those type of changes, what role can consumers play, and how are they contributing, maybe even inadvertently, to modern slavery?
Yeah, so I think the role of the consumer is a really interesting one. And also it goes back to the two different pieces of legislation. So in the Modern Slavery Act, the consumer is actually positioned as a key stakeholder. So the Modern Slavery Act works on an assumption that consumers will actually read disclosures, modern slavery statements that businesses are making, and as a result of that, change their purchasing behaviours and their decisions to shop from more ethical businesses. However, there's some fundamental flaws in that assumption, and there's a lot of reasons why that's almost impossible for consumers to do, and that's how the Modern Slavery Act really relies on enforcement. So at the moment, it's based on this idea that consumers will influence the market and market pressures will enforce the reporting requirements on businesses. Whereas I think, so some of the research I've done and some of the research I've been looking at through my PhD really shows that consumers expect that it's the role of the state and the role of businesses to actually stop importing goods made with forced labour, to stop using forced labour in the supply chains, to stop exploiting people, and they don't see it as their responsibility to have to try and do that research and do all the background work in order to make those more ethical decisions in their purchasing, because the consumer also has a lot of other things that they're trying to take into account when they're making purchasing decisions. Your things that you consume every day, there's a lot of different things that you would consider when doing that. So I'm of that opinion as well, that actually there's a responsibility on the state, on the Australian government, to take more meaningful action to be able to prevent and protect consumers from actually being complicit in that modern slavery in the global supply chain as well.
Yeah, it's a really interesting finding that you're talking about there, around that consumers are pretty much overwhelmed with a whole range of decision-making factors and processes, and I'm sure everyone wants to do the right thing when it comes to choosing the right products or supporting those right brands, but they have to be informed, or at least clearly understood what's really involved. So there's a whole level of complexity that most consumers would be really challenged to understand.
Absolutely. So at the moment, when a consumer looks at a modern slavery statement, for example, they often may not have a background in understanding what modern slavery in a global supply chain actually looks like, and what risk to modern slavery may exist in a particular product or in a particular region around the world or in a particular industry. So they're trying to assess this information that a business is disclosing without having that background knowledge. And I think for even those of us who work and study in this this space, it's a really complex thing to do, to be able to assess whether or not a business is taking meaningful action or not. And so the chance for a consumer to be what we're calling slavery washed, so the equivalent of greenwashed when we're talking about the environmental sector, is really high, because it is, a consumer may be deceived by what looks like good business, ethical business practice, but actually really may just be really good PR marketing strategies by businesses. So it is, I think, irresponsible to really place that responsibility on the consumer as a key stakeholder, and really that's where the requirement for the state to come in to take more meaningful action to legislate against this. However, in saying that, I think there's also, a lot of consumers are really concerned about this issue, and they do want to be able to take steps to be able to prevent it. And I think one of the most important things that consumers can do is to communicate to both their local politicians that this is an important issue for them. So very well that this bill needs to pass the House of Representatives in order for it to come into law. And I think in order for it to do that, of course, it needs to have the support of the coalition government. So I think, if you are a consumer watching this and you're interested in this, I would, suggest that you write to your local MP and let them know that this is an issue that you are interested in and that you think needs to have more action on, as well as consumers can also write to their favourite companies and let them know that this is something that they care about and that they want their favourite businesses to be able to engage in really meaningfully.
Wonderful. It's such a great pleasure to have your insights, Kyla. It's been a really great eye-opener on so many levels there. And I'm sure all of our audience, viewers, people involved with supply chain, importers, exporters who are watching this segment will really be provoked about thinking about how they can improve their own supply chains just by listening to you. So thanks so much for that.
Thanks for having me, Lawrence.
My pleasure. So you've just heard from Kyla Ravey. Stick around. After these short messages, we'll be joined by another industry expert on this really important topic. See you very soon.
Hi, my name's Leanne Lewis and I'm the owner of InSync Personnel. I wanted to share some details with you of a new job opportunity that we are currently recruiting that may be of interest to you or someone that you know. Our client is a global leader within the international transport and logistics space. They are currently seeking to employ an experienced licensed customs broker for their Sydney branch. You, the successful candidate, will be supported by customs classifiers and management. They will provide you with a corporate office culture, competitive salary package, and in return, wanting an employee that is serious about their customs career. So if this role sounds of interest to you, please head to our website for more details. Stay safe.
This next guest is all about sustainability and ethical finance. Respected for his expertise in the sustainability and ethical investment market, James Cronin's mission is to improve clients' businesses' performance. A regular contributor to the industry on topics such as renewables, energy efficiency, sustainable finance, and ESG investment trends, James shares his insight into ethical, sustainable investment strategies. Great to catch up again, James. How are you going?
Yeah, excellent. Enjoying lockdown.
Yeah, best can be expected, as they say. James, what type of processes or policies are you seeing corporates introduce to measure and manage their supply chain risks?
Yeah, it's an interesting space. Over the past sort of year and a half, we've really seen it shift. So it's very much a pandemic kind of approach with a lot more staff and exposures, people working at home. How do you manage that? And we've seen kind of the extension of the home office. Obviously, is an extension to greater impacts, and the policies and procedure space has been really kind of evolving. How do you manage exposure sites in terms of you as an organization? What risks are you exposed to? And the supply chain space specifically is quite interesting because of this pandemic approach. We're seeing obviously a lot of regulation changes and impacts, and globalization has really hit the ground, and supply chain impacts are there. And I think what we've really started to realize is that kind of who we are as a business and what we're trying to achieve. Our statement as a business and the ethics and morals is really impacting your supply chain and your suppliers. So what we've really seen is the last year, it's more of a conversational piece with suppliers. They're not just a supplier, they're an extension of you and what you're doing. And so there's really a search for a more granular approach to managing those suppliers and those relationships. not just kind of sending them a proposal or sending them a response or a tender. It's more about understanding them, understanding their risks, that they're part of what you're doing and what you say and what you represent in the market, and really drilling down into what risks might be impacting them, collaborating with them, sharing experiences and learnings, especially in this modern world where technology can really help drive those details and information.
Yeah, it's really interesting, James. I think some of those words that I've really sort of honed in on there with your answer is definitely the collaboration piece, the extension of the company. It isn't just a transactional deal anymore. It is very much about collectively trying to improve everyone's outcomes and everyone's benefits. So, yeah, really important. And I agree with you. I think companies are definitely taking a much deeper dive into their suppliers. James, you talk about financial products which SMEs can access due to the ESG performance. Can you provide a couple of examples and some of the strategies businesses have taken to access these type of financial products?
Yeah, the product space, especially in the financial services sector, has really become quite an interesting area. We've seen changes in terms of ESG as a risk measurement tool. It's impacting credit ratings now. A lot of credit ratings are being downgraded because of ESG risks that typically weren't assessed. It's been quite an interesting evolution of ESG as a term. What was originally thought of as an environmental piece and a sustainability piece is now, most of our conversations are with CFOs or CEOs. One about the financial impacts and the other about kind of reputational damage, risk mitigation strategies. And all of that's kind of filtered into the product creation side. We've seen banks look at various different sustainability-linked loans or SDG-linked loans to look at various different point benefits for businesses that are achieving these outcomes, so that they're understanding that ESG can have a financial impact on performance, and therefore they're rewarding customers and businesses that are achieving those benchmarks and targets. This challenge that we've got at the moment, there's a whole range of issues in terms of, modern slavery is one that pops up a lot, to transition to a low carbon economy. And all of these service providers, financial services providers specifically, are really looking for better understanding of who their customer is. And that's driving, this new evolution of products and how you are servicing them, how are you providing products to them, can you price them differently? So financial services, lending products, we've seen a lot of investment products, insurance products in the ESG space, as well as even things like foreign exchange pricing benefits if you're achieving, SDG outcomes and actually improving risk performance from an ESG perspective.
Wow. Yeah, it's as you say, it's a whole new beast now, and companies want to do the right thing, but if they're also getting those benefits as a result, that's even more incentives and reasons to go in and really invest the time and effort to do this properly with the ESG space. James, what type of technologies are being used to better understand these ESG risks and the performances? How do you actually, is there a benchmark? What sort of technology do you use to measure everything?
Yeah, it's a challenging space, I would say, for most businesses at the moment. There can be up to 10 ESG frameworks that are out there. You can talk about GRI, SASB, GRESB if you're a property developer, and it is quite challenging to understand which ESG reporting framework is appropriate for you. And we found that a whole range of clients that have said, right, well, what's best practice? Is that a long-term goal that we need to achieve? How do we get there? We need to build a program, an ESG program, where we can kind of start creating short-term benefits, short-term targets, and really working out how to achieve them. Technology is an interesting space because we've got really what I would say is siloed solutions at the moment. Things like carbon reporting tools that are out there to measure what your footprint is, and then really identify offset systems or approaches. You've got ESG reporting tools which really look at that broad risk management and risk addressing situation. So at the moment, it's a solution that really has an opportunity in the market to create a technology that is going to address all of those different problems. When we do an ESG report, the engagement that you have is right across. You're impacting human resources, you're impacting finance, you're impacting treasury, you're impacting technology, cybersecurity. So it is building the right program and system internally is a challenge in itself, and it can be quite a difficult task to understand and map the technology solutions. So yeah, we're seeing quite a complex web of solutions out there, and we're really looking forward to seeing what's going to evolve in that market, in the technology space, to make this a little bit cleaner and easier for businesses to navigate. Yeah,
you're right, James. I think that so many companies, they look at implementing an ESG framework, and it's sort of a daunting process for them. So, it can be something that it's been a bit of in the too hard basket for a while, but now it's starting to really come to a point of must-haves, not nice-to-haves. So implementing an ESG strategy, it's a big undertaking. Where's the best place for an SME to start, especially? I mean, people or companies who might not have the big resources of the big boys, especially as an SME, how can they put in place the right ESG framework?
Yeah, it's very much a consulting approach that I think a lot of these SMEs have to understand. You've got to start somewhere. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of changes in this market in the last 6 months, where if you're not addressing ESG risks, you're getting scrapped from supplier agreements, contracts, without warning, even. So it is a little bit of a scary time, I would say. And I think that the time is now to spend a little bit of resources or understanding to look at what those risks might be and start building that strategy. I would say certainly the best starting point is to really map out what are the ESG frameworks out there, what risks might be appropriate to you, and then start building a strategy from there. I don't think in the short term, there's going to be critical risk around not having an ESG report as such, but certainly not having that strategy in place over the next year or two is just going to open you up to a range of risks, from supplier agreements, your engagement with financial services contractors. It's so broad and challenging, your regulatory risks. It's a strategy piece that you should be doing now. And I'd suggest kind of looking at, what providers out there. We as an organization do strategic consulting work where we kind of help navigate what's right for you and give you that kind of that push in the right direction. And we help along the way as much as needed, but it's something that needs to start now. And we've really seen a couple of our clients that came to us after the piece, that they said, well, look, I didn't know much about ESG. I heard it was a risk. I heard it was something that's coming on, but all of a sudden they've been scrapped from these supplier agreements, and it was something that they could have been warned about earlier, but it's just happened so quickly in this market. They just didn't know where to begin.
Yeah, it's very true, James. I think it's definitely a risk mitigation, and I get involved with a lot of supply chain global RFQs and tenders, and it's definitely really becoming a prevalent situation. Whereas, as you pointed out, if a company wants to try and win work as a service provider in a supply chain space, they typically now have to have an ESG or CSR or some sort of modern slavery framework in place, because otherwise you just can't, you won't get shortlisted into the next stage, or if at all, you might not even be included in an RFQ or tender process. So it's very much something that, especially global supply chains and global companies, are pushing down to all their markets. And it can be something that SMEs, especially if you look at Australia, our marketplace, there's a whole range of subcontractor models right throughout every type of industry sector. And supply chain's definitely a big user of subcontractor agreements. So it is something that so many companies need to get up to speed with, and the sort of expertise that you have on offer is something that I'm sure these companies can leverage and say, look, James, this is our industry sector, this is what the type of framework we think we need, but you can help them put together and make sense of it all. So it's been amazing to have you on the show. Really enjoy, and congratulations on the work you're doing. So let's stay in touch, and love to get you back on again, maybe on a specific supplier agreement type framework or ESG framework discussion, which is complementary to this forced labour bill topic today.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me, Lawrence.
Thanks, James. So you've just heard from James Cronin. We'll be back up after this break to wrap up the episode with Anthony Gaddy from Symphony 7. Stick around. We'll see you very soon.
Think about the clothes you're wearing, the food you're eating, or even the furniture in your home. There is a story and history associated with every product you've ever bought. Unfortunately, sometimes the workers who make your products are subjected to terrible working conditions, are not treated fairly, or the manufacturing process is harmful to the environment. There are many forms of modern slavery and damaging production methods, but it's up to us, industry leaders and the consumers themselves, to take a stand so that we can contribute to a healthier planet and to changing the lives of everyone involved across the global supply chains for the better. Ethical Trade Alliance enables buyers to make informed choices on all of the products they purchase.
Coming up next is Anthony Gaddy, founder and CEO of Symphony 7, which believes in profit used as a force for good. Helping organisations grow and make a difference, Anthony brings together like-minded industry leaders to tackle issues such as sustainability and modern slavery in all its forms. Great to see you again, Anthony. Thanks so much for joining me on today's episode.
Thanks for having me here. It's a good privilege.
Anthony, who or what is Symphony 7? Let's really explain this to the audience and the viewers.
Yeah, sure. Symphony 7 is a community which we're building. It's already well underway, but essentially it's a group of people who believe that together we're better and who are intent on collaborating to create profit for good, so that together on a global scale, we can go after the uplift of the environment and create at least 1 billion positive impacts for human beings over the next 15 years.
Wonderful. And tell me, why do you feel passionately about this topic of slavery?
Lawrence, I actually had the fascinating experience of growing up in the thick of what we will call racist apartheid South Africa. And I'd say my favorite photo of all time is a photo that was taken by my wife, my Australian wife. I took her back to South Africa to show where I grew up, and I had the incredible privilege of catching up, reconnecting with my godmother, a black lady called Christina, who literally brought me up as a young kid. And there we were standing on the beach holding hands as equals with the waves washing in. Because when I was a kid, she wasn't allowed on the beach unless she was minding the white children, me and my sister, because there were big signs out the front saying whites only. So while I might not call that slavery because she wasn't forced to work for us, it's questionable whether it was ethical or fair, because she was earning maybe $300 a month and she was systematically deprived of education, as were 36 million other black people at the time.
Yeah, well, as you said, you've been exposed to or experienced that whole situation firsthand. So why do you think, that's going back many years now, why do you think slavery still exists in the modern world?
It's probably two main reasons. One I'd say is culture. I think there are certain cultures where it's just embedded and people and minority groups are systematically oppressed. But thousands of years ago, it was okay for a man to beat a woman over the head, drag her into the cave and do whatever and force her to do whatever. But I would like to think that we've evolved a lot as a species and that kind of behavior is no longer necessary. And the other, I think, is convenience. If you think about some of the larger corporations, it's pretty convenient to employ slave labor, and that, of course, helps the bottom line. It doesn't mean that it's ethical, and it doesn't mean that it should continue.
Yeah, that's very true. And what can be done, Anthony? We've heard from other speakers today, but what do you think we can do more?
I think the first most important thing is to just open the conversation, just like you're doing right here. Because I learned from Dr. Emma Fulu of the Equality Institute that education is one of the biggest possible things we can do for impact in this area. And just through people becoming more aware of what's going on, it opens the opportunities, for them to do something and to take action. And I think also legislation has a big role to play. If it's not legal to import goods that were made using slave labor that's driving really poor impact for people, then companies might think twice before doing it. Of course, then there's the question of enforcing the legislation and actually some level of prosecution so people know it's not legal and it's not okay. But then I think another thing is I heard from Kyla earlier. She was saying it's really hard for consumers to make clever decisions around where to buy, what to buy. But Lawrence, I know what you're doing with the Ethical Trading Alliance. You're going to make it really easy for people. And I'm thinking for people like me, you and anyone else watching the show, to be able to walk into a department store or any store really, and to wave our phone at a garment or an item in the retail area, and to just look at the phone and be able to see, whether the producer's ethical in the way they produced it and in the way they shipped it. To me, that sounds like a no-brainer. It sounds like it's going to make those decisions really easy. And what better a way to speed up those decisions than democratize it, put it in the hands of the users. I have great faith that a lot of people will make highly ethical decisions if you make it easy for them.
I agree. Yeah, thank you, Anthony. I think it's very true that all of us as consumers, we never want to contribute to any some sort of modern slavery or any negative impacts on people or the planet. I think if we've got that simple awareness and it's quick and easy, then I think not many of us would actually shy away from that. We'd always make the right choices. So,
yeah, Lawrence, I've got to qualify that just for the record, I have no shares in your company and no vested interest, but I genuinely believe that with what you're doing, it'll just make it so much easier for people to make beautiful decisions. And I believe that the average human being will make those decisions in favor of kindness to others and in favor of the abolition of slave labor.
I agree totally. Now, Anthony, I think, let's talk about, you've got an amazing event coming up. I believe it's next week, the New Status Quo. Tell the audience about that, please.
Yeah, sure. It's a sustainability forum. And thankfully, we've been able to attract some amazing people as advisors to the forum. We're bringing experts to the panel once a quarter. And rather than just making it an educational forum, we're intent on making it an action forum. So every time we have a forum, we will provide options towards the end of the forum, just simple actions that people can take that will make a fundamental difference on the planet. And it's amazing to see how many people are leaning in. The registrations are strong. And I'm inspired. When he was 10 years old at the time, my son asked me a question around, will he still be alive when Melbourne and all the other coastal cities get submerged and there's food insecurity and people drowning because we didn't do enough in the 2020s to combat, the breakdown of the environment. I thought, wow, that 19-year-old should be thinking of that question. And he was actually very worried about it. Yeah. So we've really been inspired to take action. And thankfully, we're surrounded by a lot of people with great intention. And I firmly believe that once we collaborate, there's so many examples when individuals and companies and governments collaborate, extraordinary things are possible. And I believe we have no choice. It's not only irresponsible not to take action, it's not sustainable. I think the planet will survive, but the question being asked here is whether the human race will survive. And I know which answer we want.
Yeah, no, it's great to know you, Anthony. I know the passion you genuinely have in making a difference to so many individuals and the lives of others. And I think that the powerhouse of people that you bring together through Symphony 7 is mind-boggling. It's just amazing. So congratulations to you and the team at Symphony 7 for the great work you're doing. I've already registered for next week's event, so I'll be there listening in and making sure that I can soak up as much information from those great speakers as much as possible as well. It's been great to have you on the show. Privileged to talk to you as always. Let's look forward to speaking again, and I would love to get you on the show and talk about a sustainability specific show to complement today's forced labour bill issue as well. So thanks so much, Anthony. Great to catch up again.
Well, thanks, Lawrence. Right back at you. It's a good privilege to be here.
Likewise. Thanks, Anthony. So you just heard from Anthony Guddy from Symphony 7. As you heard, they've still got a few tickets left, I believe, for next week's sustainability event called The New Status Quo. We'll have all the details on the screen. Make sure you get along to that. It's so much to take away, very complementary to what our discussion has been about today in relation to forced labour, the importance of making a real difference. and helping everyone across global supply chains, but also the individuals involved as well, to make a positive difference. Thanks so much for watching today's episode. I hope you found it really informative and inspirational. Make sure you stick around next week and watch another episode of Trade Australia with me, Lawrence Christophels. Take care, and we'll see you soon.